All right, so it's 10 o'clock, so I'm going to introduce you all to Dr. Prasanta Bhattacharya, who is a brilliant scholar, but also we go back a long time. So we're from the same school, we went to the same college, and now we ended up in the same SICSS, right? So Dr. Prasanta Bhattacharya is a research scientist and innovation lead in the Social and Cognitive Computing Department at the Institute of High Performance Computing at A*STAR in Singapore, where he works on network science and behavioral analytics. And he holds a PhD in information systems from the Department of Information Systems and Analytics at NUS, where he studied network science with special focus on predictive and inferential methods in large social networks. His current research agenda aims at understanding the role of big data in emerging social and social and business applications from finance, education, and healthcare. Prasanta actively collaborates with major industry partners around the world and is presented his research in leading computer science, information systems, and marketing science venues around the globe. So without further ado, Prasanta, take it away. I think your video is fine, your screen share, your slides are working. So clicker is it okay? No? All right. Okay.
All right, yeah, good morning, and thanks to Brian, Jack, and other organizers at SICSS for having me here. It's wonderful to be part of this inaugural event.
Oh, just one. I think it's working. The mic. Okay. Yeah.
How about now?
Yeah, better.
All right. Yeah, sorry about that. Some of us are doing this actually like a really long time, so technical glitches are expected. So yes, this morning I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a journey on broadly the topic of social networks and human behavior. And this touches on a couple of things that you might have studied in the previous couple of days, as well as it alludes to things that you learned about in the keynote by Sandra. This draws broadly on work that other people have done, including the really wonderful TED talk that he just watched by Nicholas Christakis. So he's done some wonderful work on how different kinds of behaviors spread. And then I'll be talking about specifically some problems with doing this line of work, and what are some of the methodological tools that we have at our disposal to tackle some of these challenges, right? And then I'll try to close towards the end by talking about some specific projects and studies that I've been part of, hopefully to give you a sense of what these kind of studies look like when they're actually doing them. Okay. All right, so over the next like an hour or so, this is my plan for today, and feel free to project and then we can make it more interactive. But I'll start off by giving you like a very brief primer on social network analysis, just so that we're all on the same page with the vocabulary, right? And this might be repetitive for some of you who have some background in social networks or graph theory, so bear with us. After that, I'm going to talk specifically about the problem of estimating or inferring peer effects or peer influence on social networks. Directly linked to what a lot of the things that was mentioning.
I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you once. You're a bit broken on Zoom according to the participants.
Okay.
So maybe you can try moving the speaker closer to the. Or maybe that will be better. Yeah. Let's see.
All right. This is better for the participants.
A lot better. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good. Yeah. So I think then we'll talk about a little bit about peer effects or peer influence or social influence on networks. And then we'll try to conclude by discussing some specific studies and also kind of try to learn more from you about what kind of network context you're interested in, right? And we can have a chat about that. All right, so let's start with something on a slightly lighter note. Some of those images on the screen might be familiar, especially if you're a Game of Thrones fan. This is actually a network of Game of Thrones characters where each node is a character, and if when two characters share screen space in an episode, they have a link between them. And the higher the number of occurrences in an episode, the larger the size of the node. All right. And the higher the co-occurrences in an episode, so two characters co-occur in a scene a lot of times, if the links between them are really thick, right? So this is a representation of characters from a really popular game show, a popular TV show. And the reason I want to show you is, all right, so you might not be able to see that, but what I mentioned there is, this is a really good way of representing social structures, right? So every social institution, organizations, etc., are comprised of units, and those units could be individuals. In a TV show, they could be characters. And then those individuals in a graph or a network are generally represented as nodes. And again, depending on which field you're from, you might call them vertices or points, actors, etc. Right? And then, of course, you'd notice that these nodes are connected by links. And again, depending on which field you're from, you might call them relationships or edges, etc. Right? And then these relationships could be anything, right? They could be friendship, they could be other kinds of relationships like co-authorship in a scientific network. It could be, kinship networks, familial ties, romantic networks, etc. So all of these have been extensively studied in, say, sociology and other fields. Right? Now, let's do something different, right? So we'll keep the same actors, but I'll show you a different kind of network. All right, same actors, they're all from Game of Thrones. But then you notice that the edges are different. So take a guess. What do you think the relationships here imply in this network? Right. So the previous network was about co-occurrence in a scene. What do you think the links here imply? So if you've seen this image before, don't answer, but take a guess. What do you think those links imply in this network? If you squint real hard, I can actually read it off the screen, but I know it's really small, so don't try to read it off the screen.
Who killed whom?
All right, so Shubhan says, who killed whom?
No, that's not actually no. Feel like.
All right. I mean, that's a fair guess. Killings are pretty common in Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
But any other guesses?
There's some people like that.
Yeah.
There's some guesses like the master and
Master-slave relationship? No. Even like dominant structure?
Yeah,
like if you focus on like the really thick links, the really strong edges, you might get a hint of what's going on. How much they really like or hate someone? All right, that's actually closer. Yes. Lines spoken. Lines spoken. So that's actually similar to the previous network, where if you co-occur in a scene, you're speaking to each other. This is actually closer to what you mentioned earlier. Yeah. Help. Supporting network. No, it's actually the opposite of that. So this is a network that, yeah, so this is a betrayal network of who betrays whom in the first 6 seasons of Game of Thrones. And so the thickness of the links are actually proportional to the impact of the betrayal. If someone kills someone, you have a really thick edge, right? And you might notice there's some dashed or dotted lines. Those actually denote implied betrayal, where there's a betrayal that's implied but not proven yet in the show, right? So the reason I wanted to show you this is also to point out that sometimes in a network, relationships don't necessarily have to be like structured, quote unquote, right? So they don't have to be about social relationships. So in this case, it's about an interaction, like a betrayal. It's kind of a behavior. So there can be contexts where you might have to create networks purely based on behavioral data, interaction data. And this is a good example of how you can represent that. Another thing to notice from here is that your links or relationships are not necessarily binary. So it's not present or absent. They can have certain weights or strength, right? So your edges here are weighted based on how serious the betrayal is, right? So it's not a binary relationship anymore. Okay, so some couple of things to keep in mind. So if some of you are interested about the origins of social networks, and I know Sandra mentioned some of these in her opening keynote, but it actually goes, I mean, the intellectual foundations of social network predates any formal methods by a couple of centuries. So there was a Swiss naturalist, Pierre Hoover. He actually did an entire chapter in his thesis on the dominant structure among bumblebees. And these have fascinated social networks researchers for like hundreds of years. Because as you know, these actually have very complex social hierarchies, right? So I would argue that this thesis by Pierre Hoover in 1802 was arguably the first systematic observation. So you can kind of think of it as an ethnographic observation of how bees interact with each other in their family, right? Around the same time, another Swiss mathematician, physicist, astronomer, and a host of other things, Leonard Euler, actually proposed a resolution of the very famous Königsberg 7 bridges problem. And again, I mean, if you've done a course on graph theory, or if you've kind of wandered into a graph theory lecture accidentally on the first week, you might have seen this image. So this is actually the problem here that Euler faced was, how do you traverse each of these bridges once and exactly once in a single journey? That was the problem. And he actually found a sufficient condition to this problem, which is that so if you forget about what's going on in between the land masses, but if you reduce the land masses to nodes and consider the bridges as links, then the sufficient condition for what later got called as an Eulerian path to exist is that exactly 0 or 2 nodes need to have an odd number of bridges. So if that is, if you notice here, so there are 5 land masses, right? That's 5, 4 land masses, and 7 bridges. And each of these 4 land masses actually have odd number of bridges connecting to it. Satisfy that condition. Later, actually, it was bombed during the World War, and then some bridges got destroyed, and then satisfied that condition. But anyway, the point of showing you this is to point out that the foundations of graph theory predate any formal methods by at least a century. All right. If anyone's interested in understanding how we went from there to the kind of methods that we're going to see today, this is actually a really fantastic book by Linton Freeman that I really recommend that you read if you're really interested about the historical journey of social networks. Okay? So that's not to suggest that everything's really ancient, but here's actually an example of how recent networks can affect our lives. So some of you, I don't know, if might stay in Singapore, might have actually taken the MRT to come here this morning. And as you know, the Singapore MRT is actually a giant network of crisscrossing mechanical systems, right? So as a result of that, a lot of these trains tend to stop working from time to time. So I took this infographic from 2016, which shows the probability of a fault between, so what's the minimum distance traveled on average before the train shows a fault? And again, unsurprisingly, you'll notice that the east-west line, which is one of the older lines, tend to show faults with a higher probability than the newer lines like the downtown line, right? But since MRTs are a network system, what happens when one of these lines go down is that it then pushes traffic onto connected lines, right? So if your east-west line is not working, it overcrowds other lines that are linked to the east-west line. And so then you have crowding other stations, etc. So the point is you actually face network effects all the time. You don't necessarily realize it when you're facing it. But a lot of the behaviors that we exhibit and we face are direct consequences of the social as well as the physical network that we are embedded in. And I think the previous TED talk that this practice is actually referring to that point as well. Right. So let's kind of go through the tenets of social networks. So based on some of the illustrative examples that I covered, the fundamental concept behind social network is that you're an actor, but your behaviors or your actions are interdependent on others in your group. And the group could be a society, your university, your friendship network, whatever. So you are embedded in a social network, so your actions are dependent on others. It's not independent. Yeah. And then, depending on how you form these relationships, different kinds of network structures can evolve over time. You get like emergent structures in society. So persistent actions on your part can lead to very different network structures depending on how you form those networks. But then once those social structures form over time, and again, these could be organizational networks, these could be your friendship networks, these could be your networks in your family, it could even be like large scale or like country level networks. But once these networks form, what they do is in turn, they constrain or exert influence on your individual action, right? So then your actions are no longer independent, but because you're embedded in that network structure, you change or strategically change your behavior, you get influenced to act in a different way by the behavior. So if this is actually pretty much a summary of every network behavior talk ever, right? So your actions change the network changes your actions. It's as simple as that. All right, so an actual illustration of why this matters. Let's take a simple example of a 5-node network, right? So here's a question I have for you, right? So let's take Diana over here. So if Diana votes for a certain party, A, in an election, what is the likelihood that Carl, who's connected to Diana over here, will also vote for the same party, right? And again, this is similar to the problem of obesity in the previous talk that we just saw, right? So, I mean, the first question that can come to your mind is, well, should there be an association to begin with, right? Just because these two individuals are connected in a network doesn't mean that there needs to be, some association in their behavior. A second order problem I'm particularly interested in is if you do see a correlation in their behavior, can we attribute it to the network type? So just because Carl and Diana vote for the same party, can I attribute that similarity to the fact that they're connected in a network? So that's almost a question of like causal inference, right? Does the network cause the behavior? And then, of course, the final question that you get asked by reviewers all the time is, well, great, so what? So what do we do with this, right? And so there are two things that you can do. So assuming that you find an example where the network actually does cause the behavior, this is, of course, of great value in economics, in marketing, in organizational literature, because it then tells you that you can use things like word-of-mouth marketing, right? So if I know that my purchasing behavior affects my friend's purchasing behavior, companies can actually incentivize me to talk more about my purchases with my friends. And then when I tell them about my purchases, they go and buy more. So there's a lot of studies that talk about how word-of-mouth marketing actually works really well and sometimes much better than other traditional forms of marketing. On the other side, if you're a government, if you're a policymaker, this actually has implications for how you make policy. So there's a lot of recent work in, for example, in how you manage certain chronic healthcare conditions. And one intervention that has been suggested in many different contexts is the idea of a peer group or a peer support. And so the evidence for whether peer support actually works to help someone manage a chronic health condition comes from literatures, from studies on social networks, right? So if there's evidence that peer influence happens in that behavior, you can use peer support or peer-based interventions in your policy, right? So one clear advantage of studying peer effects in networks is A, it helps the bottom line of companies by improving on their marketing. B, it helps educators, regulators, governments make better policy for whatever behavior they're trying to change, right? Okay, so the good thing about studying networks is you find examples of the network behavior interplay that I just talked about in pretty much any field that you can think about, right? So at this point, you think about what you're interested in, your field of work, and I can guarantee that there would be some high-value questions about networks and behavior in that particular context. So I've just pointed out a couple of areas that came to my mind. Communications in digital media. Interesting point of questioning could be about how do your online networks affect your content generation and content consumption behavior, right? In economics, finance, marketing, a long-standing area of interest in these fields is about how social networks affect things like product adoption, diffusion of services, diffusion of products. It's a very common area of working in macroeconomics and microeconomics too. In public health, of course, and this again, there's a lot of work by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler in areas on how things like alcohol consumption, smoking behavior, substance abuse, criminal tendencies tend to percolate in a social network through peer influence. So there's a lot of interest in public health, law, etc. in these areas. And again, these are just some hand-picked areas. There are many other areas like power systems, in computer science, etc., where these kind of problems go over. Social anthropology is another good area where one of the historical fields from where social networks emerge. So there are a lot of areas where you see reflections of the same network behavior problem that I just spoke about. And there are different ways of dealing with it. All right, so before I get into the specific problem of why it's difficult to assess peer influences in these contexts, I'll take a quick pit stop to see if there are any thoughts or questions at this point that we can talk about. Yeah. Or something that comes to your mind as potentially objectionable with what you just see. All right, good. So let's get into the next part where I'm going to talk about why whatever I've said so far is actually incredibly difficult to do in actual real context. All right. So the TED talk that we just saw is brilliant. I mean, it's a brilliant exposition of some of the work, but on the ground, it's actually a lot more challenging to do than what comes across in the TED talk. All right, so this is the classic problem, and I think if you've done a session on causal inference, so this would be slightly easier to appreciate. In a traditional causal inference model, what you want to do is, for say, for person I, you want to intervene on a certain attribute or behavior of that person. So we call it xi, and you want to see the change in some outcome. Let's call it yi. All right. Now, in networks, we generalize that from the individual to a dyad. So a dyad basically is a link, an edge, a pair of factors, a pair of nodes. So the specification then becomes what happens when instead of intervening on xi, you intervene on yj. So you intervene on the focal behavior, but for a different person in the network. And you want to see the effect on yi. All right. So you're not intervening on the person, you're intervening on the peers or the network. And you want to study the effect of that on your focal user, yi. And again, this is just a simple specification. I'm simplifying things a bit. There could be other alternate ways of studying this problem. So for instance, you might be interested in intervening on a different behavior. All right, so let's take a simple example of this. If you want to study how if you have rich friends, you start earning more. Right? It's the peer hypothesis. So if your friends start earning more, they somehow influence you to start looking for higher paying jobs or whatever, and you start earning more. So that's a problem of Yj influencing Yi, where Y is income, right? Wealth creation. Alternatively, you can think about how your friends getting more years of education might influence you to start earning more. So there are two different behaviors. So maybe if there was a way to intervene on your friends' education, like incentivizing them to do a new course, would that change your focal behavior, which is about wealth creation? So that could be another problem where you intervene on a different behavior, but you want to study the outcome of the focal behavior. All right. So these kind of peer level causal processes, right, from individual to dyad. So dyad level causal processes exist everywhere. Again, very similar to what I described earlier. In adoption behavior or for products, diffusion of innovations, spreading of disorders, like the fact that we're all wearing masks, testament to that. Voting behavior, that's another very active area of work, about how do you assess peer effects in how people vote in elections. And of course, content consumption is something that I'm not particularly very interested in. So I'll talk a bit about that later. Right, so here's the challenge, right? So if users in a dyad tend to show correlated behavior, okay, let's take the same example of your friends earning more. If your friends earn a lot of money, you end up earning a lot of money. So you see correlated behavior in the network. But the key challenge here is separating the peer influence, so the fact that your friends influenced you to start earning more, from other confounding factors that could have potential, that could explain the same behavior in different ways. All right. Now, I mean, there are many ways to explain this, but so what I like to do is, so I actually picked this story from an actual paper, and I'll share this paper with you after the talk. It's a fantastic paper, and it actually argues that it's very difficult to separate peer influence from other sources of causal relationships, just from observational data. But the paper starts with this example, and I'm actually quoting from the paper because I haven't changed the story. Suppose that there are two friends, Ian and Joey, and Ian's parents ask him, if your friend Joey jumped off a bridge, would you jump too? Right? And the authors ask the question, why might Ian answer yes? All right. So two friends, Ian and Joey. Imagine if Joey jumped off a bridge, and then you see Ian went and jumped off the bridge as well. Why? Right? So why would Ian do that? And so the paper actually proposes that there are many different reasons why this could be happening. So this is what we are interested in. So we would want to basically prove that Joey is bad influence, right? So what the parents want to actually persuade Ian that don't hang out with Joey, it's bad influence. This is what we want to estimate from our data, that Joey's example influenced Ian to do that. But there are 5 other confounding explanations for this behavior, again, from the paper. So here's another alternate explanation, all right? Joey infected Ian with a parasite which suppresses fear of falling. So this is like a biological contagion, right? So when this paper was written, this was like a ridiculous idea. This is clearly aged like wine. So this is an example of biological influence, but not social influence. Another alternate explanation, maybe Joey and Ian are friends because of their shared interest or shared fondness for jumping off bridges. It's something they really like to do. And so the timing is just incidental. It's just coincidental. It's a coincidence that they jumped one before the other, but they were both planning to jump anyway because they like jumping off bridges. So this is actually homophily on the focal behavior. So they're similar on that behavior. The timing is just incidental. Here's another explanation. Joey and Ian became friends through a thrill-seeking club whose membership rolls are publicly available. So I know that they're both members of that thrill-seeking club. And that's why they went and jumped off the bridge. And again, the order is incidental. And so this is observed homophily on a secondary behavior. All right, so there's another behavior they are similar on, which push them to do that. Here's a fifth explanation. Joey and Ian became friends through their shared fondness for roller coasters, not a thrill-seeking club. And it's actually because of their underlying thrill-seeking propensity that they actually went and jumped off a bridge. So in this case, it's what's called latent homophily, because they are similar, but not on a behavior that you can observe. Right? There's no evidence that they are, there's nothing in the data to tell you that they really like roller coasters. But this is an alternate explanation, right? And then finally, this is another very common explanation that maybe they both realize the bridge is about to collapse, and their best bet is to jump off it into the river, and the timing is just coincidental. So this is not about homophily. This is about exposure to a common context. So just to give a more relatable example, think about you and your friend, you both drive to work, and you see a giant billboard with the latest iPhone ad on the road, right? So you both see it when you're driving to work, and the fact that you both go and purchase an iPhone has nothing to do with influence or homophily. It's just that you both see the ad on your way to work. So the timing is just incidental, right? So these are like alternate explanations that you actually have to disentangle or separate out in a method so that you can convincingly say that the behavior was caused by social influence. Right.
What's the why do we need to separate 3, 4, and 5? Because we can say that a latent factor of 5 can basically be expressed as 3 and 4.
Right, that's a good question. So why do we need to separate out 3, 4, and 5? So 3 and 4 is about modeling homophily based on some behavior that you can observe, right? So assuming that you know that you did a survey, and you know that Ian and Joey have reported high fondness for jumping off bridges, as well as reported that they're members of some club. So depending on what you're modeling the homophily on, you might be able to model one or the other. So imagine if you had no idea that they're members of this club, right? Or you did not include that variable in the data from the data, you would not find any evidence of homophily, because they're not members, they don't have a shared fondness for jumping off bridges, and you didn't add this variable to your model. So the key difference here is this is homophily based on the behavior that you're trying to model, which is jumping off bridges directly. So they have a direct similarity on that behavior. This one is about homophily on a different attribute or different behavior, which is also in your data. You have data on that, but maybe you don't model it, right? So they're similar in some other behavior. This is different because this is latent, so you don't observe it. They have some underlying dispositional similarity to each other, which you don't measure, they don't report. And this will cause problems this will bias the estimates of homophily or influence in your studies.
So to some extent, if I collect enough behavioral tendencies, right? Do you like going to roller coasters? Do you like to go on adventures? All of that, it will be loaded onto the same latent factor anyway, right?
That's good. Yes. So anything that you don't measure will load here or in the error. Right? And so this is again controlling latent homophily, or the inability to control latent homophily is like the reason half of our papers get rejected.
I guess in my mind I was saying the 6 possible reasons should be mutually exclusive. That's why I was.
Yeah, so they're not.
But I don't think
they're not mutually exclusive. Yes. All right. So solutions. So the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about causal inference is, hey, well, why can't we do a randomized experiment, which is the gold standard in methods, right? So there are 2 ways to do it on a network. Again, on a network, right? The first one, and this is arguably the hardest to do, is what's called network randomization. So here, think about it. You are randomizing on the network structure. So you're taking individuals and randomly assigning them to a different network structure. Alternatively, you keep the individuals constant, but you randomize their network structure, how they're embedded. And I mean, right off the bat, you can imagine why this is incredibly difficult to do in any meaningful sense, right? So first of all, not all types of networks can be randomized, right? A good example of this is a friendship network, right? I can't put people in a room and tell them that, all right, the next half an hour, pretend that you're friends, right? There are some behaviors or some kind of relationships that are not suitable for these kind of methods. And of course, there are feasibility issues. There are some very good papers that are exceptions to these rules. This paper by Santoro in Science actually assigns people to different kinds of network structures in a very stylized online health community. So if you send this paper to you as part of the reading list. But there are exceptions, but this is very hard to do. The most common alternative when doing experiments is what's called treatment randomization. So you keep the network constant, right? So you don't touch the network, but you assign a treatment randomly to the peers who are certain seeds in the network, and they try to see how that affects the untreated or the neighbors of the treated people. This is a common strategy. It works in certain specific contexts, but I mean, a vast majority of experiment work in networks generally have these three concerns. And every study that's ever been published on randomized experiments in networks have tried to address these in certain specific ways. So the first one, of course, is about selection concerns, right? So if you are recruiting people and then randomly assigning them a treatment, how would their behavior be different from others in the network who you did not recruit? So there are some selection concerns that you might have to deal with, selection bias. The second, of course, and this is my favorite challenge, and it's about network interference or what's called treatment leakage. So unlike a randomized experiment in a non-network setting, a network by design is a large connected graph. Right? So people are, in theory, connected with everyone else. So if you assign a treatment to certain nodes as the treatment group, how do you guarantee that it won't spill over to the control group, direct or indirect? Okay. Actually, I have a really good example of this from the place where I work. So we generally connect to the internet through a wired internet, which is a corporate network, as well as a Wi-Fi. It's very similar to NOS. You have a wired LAN internet and Wi-Fi internet. And so one day when I was working, the Wi-Fi access got snapped. So depending on people who were working in the cubicle with the laptop docked onto the wired LAN, they could still continue working, but the people who were using the Wi-Fi, they have to stop working because the Wi-Fi snapped, right? So now what you'd imagine in a perfect situation is, well, the people whose Wi-Fi snapped stop working, they do something else, the people who have internet continue working. But what happens is because we all sit next to each other, people whose internet snapped, they kind of got up, started walking around, talking to people around them. And so after a while, no one was working, right? So this is actually a good example of a network interference where your treatment can actually spill over to people who are not directly treated because you're all living in a network. And finally, this is again, if you're running an experiment, it's very important to balance your treatment and control groups based on covariance, right? So there are a lot of methods for how you do balancing of covariance. The same problem applies for networks, except there's an added layer of complexity because now your covariance also includes the structure. So you have to balance the structure of the treatment and the control group to get unbiased estimates from the experiment, right? So these are challenges that exist. Papers that use experiments on networks try to address them in some different ways. Let me quickly run you through 4 solutions that people use to address some of these concerns. The first, and this is by far the most commonly used solution when running experiments on networks, is what's called mechanism experiments. So here, instead of manipulating or randomizing the network structure, you intervene on the channel or medium by individuals experience the network. Okay. So a good example of that is instead of assigning individuals to peers, you try to manipulate some cues, some social cues that individuals see. So it changes their view of the network. This is actually from real experiment by folks at Facebook. So I don't know if you're old enough to remember the really early interface that Facebook had for its Facebook pages. They would run these ads on Facebook to get people to like their Facebook pages. So these are two copies of ads with Facebook ads to get you to like the history channel page. And you'd notice that the main difference between these two is that in the first case, you have just a number for the number of people who have liked this page. But in the other case, you actually have the name of a friend. So that's a social cue. So it's intervening on the medium by which you see the network. So let's imagine the variable D measures the number of cues that you see when you see the ad. There's 0 for this group and 1 for that group. And then you can increase the number of social cues. So this is D is equal to 1. So you just see Clifton, and then you see 2 people over there and 3 names over there. These are all your friends. So again, you don't have visibility of your entire network, but this is a stylized context where the network is just telling you there are 2 or 3 or 1, 2 or 3 people in your friend list who have liked this page. And then you can use this context to study what's the impact of that on your liking behavior. All right, and this is why it's such a clever context. So let's take this result here. So if you notice, there's a new variable Z, which is the total number of friends who have liked the page, all right? Irrespective of whether you see it or not. This is just actual backend data on how many of your friends have liked that page. So what this result tells you is even when D is equal to 0 in all these 3 groups, right? So you don't see any social cue. Just the fact that you have more friends who have liked that page increases your likelihood of liking. So this is homophily, right? The fact that you have friends who like the Facebook page increases your chance of liking the page, even though you don't see that. You don't see any of those friends. So they use this to quantify homophily. And then within each group, when you actually end up seeing the social cue, you get a further lift in the like rate, right? So when your friends exist and you see the social cue, the chance that you like the page increases. And then finally, this marginal effect. So when you increase the number of social cues, the probability of liking increases, but at a decreasing rate, right? So the decreasing marginal difference. So after a while, it tapers off. It's a very clever design to separate out influence and homophily without actually manipulating the network. This is another famous paper in political, you can call it a political science and social media paper. Came out in Nature, and this is actually one of the first studies to test if online behavior can actually change offline behavior in any meaningful way. In this particular case, in a congressional voting outcome in the US. So again, this is again run by them on the Facebook platform. What the researchers did was they actually, when people logged into Facebook on election day, they were randomly assigned one of 3 messages. So the first was a control group, so they did not see any message. The second was an informational message. So you log into Facebook and you see this, and you see there are 3 pieces of information. The first is the number of people who voted on Facebook. There's kind of information for you. There's an I voted button. So if you click that I voted button, your friends will get to know that you have decided that you want to vote. And the third is a link, which if you click that link, you can get to know your nearest polling station. So this was a banner that was shown to them. And then this is another treatment group, which is the social message group. So here, very similar to this group. The only difference is you also get to see the people who have clicked the I voted button. So you get to see social cues. And again, I mean, I can send you the paper, and unsurprisingly, what the researchers found was that individuals who saw the social cue were more likely to click the I voted button and were more likely to actually go out and vote. I think the percentage was like 0.3 or 0.4%, very marginal increase. But again, when you swing states in actual number of votes, it actually matters. You can get a 0.3 or 0.4%. It's a very good example of how you can use certain your question was?
But for this example that you just stated, the test was whether seeing my friends like it, does it make a difference? Or is it because it was more visually appealing? In the sense that it does look more appealing. So was the experiment able to get at the definition of the treatment here,
Yes,
which was
so
trying to label?
that's a very good question. So I think in this particular case, I think the aesthetics of the visual appeal was not, I wouldn't say it was not directly ruled out, but they had an indirect way of ruling that out. So they actually also looked at the strength of kind of ties between these friends and the focal user. So if your hypothesis is true, looking at that subgroup of strong versus weak kind of setup should not change the result because it's a visual appeal. They actually did find that depending on what kind of friends you see, your behavior is different. So then that gives you more confidence. It's more about the social intervention and not about just the fact that there's a new banner with images at the bottom. Right? Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, but this is just another example to point out that this is a mechanism experiment, right? So you're not changing the network, you're just changing the way people view the network, right? All right, this is another solution, second solution to the possible method. And this is one of my favorite methods to use. And it's called a natural experiment. And in a natural experiment, the basic idea is, I mean, it's a bit of a misnomer because it's actually not a randomized experiment. There is a natural event, a chance event, that assigns people to different groups. So the assignment is kind of near random, right? And think of it in this way. A good example of this is a natural disaster. So a disaster, assuming that it's a random event, impacts certain people with a near random probability, but then leaves others untouched. And if this is relevant to the behavior that you're trying to study or the network formation, this could be used as an example, as a design to separate out treatment effect from other things. So this is an actual paper actually by my advisor, Tron Fan, published in PNAS, looking at the effect of a hurricane impact on how people made and manage their friendship networks. So the context for this was Hurricane Ike, which hit the US in 2008, which at the time was the second most costliest hurricane in the US in 2008. And so the heat map over here tells you the point of impact of the hurricane and how it spread before losing intensity and dying out. So this was the clever design that he used. So he actually looked at students from the universities that were directly affected by the hurricane, closer to where the point of impact was. And then he took a matched sample of universities that are very similar to the universities that were affected, but were not directly affected by the hurricane. So in this case, you have like a treatment control kind of situation, even though you did not randomly assign anyone, right? And so what we actually found very interestingly was that if you look at the top panel over there, that's tracking degree, which is the number of connections on average. And you actually see that, so the red line is the treatment group, the affected group, and the blue line is the control group. But there's actually no change in how many friends they make after the hurricane, right? So it's not much change. What's interesting is if you look at transitivity, right? And if you remember transitivity from the previous talk by Prasanta, in very simple words, this is about clustering in your network. You actually see that the red line, which is the treatment group, keeps increasing in clustering, while the control group dips. And so if you take the first two together, it actually tells you that people are not making new friends in the affected region, but they're making more, people are not making more friends at a higher rate as compared to the control group. So it's still an increasing line. The people are making more friends. It's very similar to the control group. But the friends they're making are mostly friends of friends, which is increasing their clustering in the affected region, right? So again, the point of showing you this is in a situation like this, you can see that this creates an exogenous shock to your network, right? It changes the network without directly impacting other things. And then you can pair this with another model, like an instrumental variable model, to then use the natural experiment to separate out the effects of the network from other things. Right? I mean, this paper was not about that, but I just want to show the paper to point out that you can get natural experiment settings in many different areas that you can cleverly use to separate out treatment effects from networks.
these universities you consider the less affected or affected? What's the
It
basis?
depends on the location, how close they are to the point of impact of the hurricane.
Yeah. But how about unaffected? There are also like geographical.
So okay, is your question about
Yeah,
how these universities are matched?
Yeah. How the match?
They're matched based on university level variables like number of students, what are their backgrounds, etc. So anything that's publicly available on these universities, like annual tuition, enrollment rates, etc.
Okay.
So this was the second solution. The third solution, again, this one's a funny one, but it's again, for want of a better name, the New Zealand option. And again, you might have actually, I don't know if you realize this, but whenever a new product is developed in a lot of tech companies, they try to implement and roll it out first in New Zealand or Australia before they roll it out, universally everywhere, right? And one of the reasons for that is, as a country, it has just the right population size to give like statistical power, but they're also English speaking, tech savvy, they have high tech adoption, and they are significantly isolated from the rest of the world to the point that if things go wrong, it won't percolate to other users in other parts. It's not going to be a lot of like reputational loss for the company in other parts of the world. So sometimes you roll out something in New Zealand, and that kind of becomes your natural treatment group, keeping the rest of the world constant. And you can see how your product features, when or not. And this again, I mean, you might not have the privilege to do this because it needs like a massive rollout of the treatment. All right, so this comes to a more computational solution to the problem. And this is called cluster randomization. So here, one option to consider could be partitioning the network into communities or clusters, and then assigning each cluster, each community to a treatment or control group instead of assigning an individual level. And again, at an intuitive level, the reason why this is attractive is because what you're trying to do is you're minimizing leakage. Because if you assign entire clusters to a treatment, you're kind of trying to minimize the fact that the interactions between the groups is minimal, because by definition, nodes within a community interact with each other more than outside the community, right? And sometimes you have natural partitions like say, New Zealand, right? And sometimes you have to use graph cutting or graph partitioning methods like community detection or label propagation. More recently, there are more sophisticated methods in networks like block modeling that you can use to create these communities and then assign the treatment, right? But this is again similar to your random assignment, but instead of randomizing on units like individuals, you randomize on clusters, right? It's a nice trade-off to the randomization problem. And then finally, of course, there could be purely observational approaches that can use, and this is again where a lot of my work focuses, using actual statistical methods on retrospective data. So I'm not an experimental researcher, so I don't do randomized experiments, but I like looking at existing data on networks and behavior, and then using a bunch of statistical methods to separate out these effects. And I'm going to talk about couple of studies that use this third one, stochastic graph models, as an example of what you can do to have a network behavior data set without running any experiments, right? Okay, so let me stop here. Shivam, how are you doing on time?
Good. You're 50 minutes in, but you can go for longer if you have more things to present. 50 minutes in, yeah.
All right, so we'll take 15 minutes to quickly run through the studies. But I mean, let's take a quick stop.
I think your mic is off.
Okay, yes, let's have a quick pit stop to see if there are any thoughts or comments on these 5 solutions that you have, even you don't have the luxury of doing a mechanism experiment or an actual randomized experiment. Any thoughts or any comments that at this point? Because this third part here, I'm a little worried, and because this is going to get slightly technical. So But so far, I'm guessing it's been easier to follow. Any thoughts or any comments? Or we can always, okay. So let me quickly go through. So here I'm broadly going to talk about two studies that one I've completed, one that I'm currently part of. Battery issue. Which actually estimate network effects.
Fix your mask.
Yeah.
Fix your mask.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about like two studies that estimate network effects in two large real-world network data sets, just to give a sense of what you can do with this. So the first one, and this comes out of my PhD thesis actually, looks at the effect of networks on large networks of online content generation. So again, as you know, social media posts are rapidly changing behaviors. People post on social media all the time. So the question that I was trying to address in that study was, can we explain change in posting behavior on the network as a function of the social network? All right. So here's a very simple illustration of the problem. So let's assume that this is my Facebook social network. All right. I have 3 friends. So this is me. All right. And just for simplicity, so I have 3 really popular friends on the platform. Right. Actually, when I created this slide, Elon Musk was not that active on social media. So this again, something that aged like milk. So imagine if a couple of my friends increase their posting behavior. So the key question that I'm trying to estimate here is what happens to my posting behavior if they increase their posting behavior? And you see versions of this problem in many different fields. So in economics, for example, this classic problem of explaining public good contribution as a function of your group size. So what happens if people in your group start contributing more, like donating more to charity? What does that do to your posting behavior, right? So you see reflections of this problem in many different contexts. And again, experimentally manipulating behavior is not realistic or useful, right? I can't catch hold of my friends and get them to post more on the social media platforms. Not feasible to do. So this is kind of the research framework. And again, the key thing that I'm trying to estimate is this. How does network formation influence my posting behavior, right? So I create my network, how does that influence posting? And this is the key challenge. Based on what I post, that actually indirectly affects how I make new friends. So maybe I'm making new friends based on what they post, right? So think about how you follow people on Twitter. Maybe you really like what they're tweeting about, you end up following them, and then you get influenced by their tweets. So it's kind of this circular dependency in causality. And then, of course, my data has a bunch of other like control variables or covariates that affect both the network formation as well as the behavior. Right, so this is another part of the problem. So these covariates affect both sides of the equation. So again, I mean, we covered this briefly. There are experimental ways to do this, and there are usual problems in running controlled experiments on these contexts. There are a bunch of non-experimental methods that have been used in the literature. And again, there are some methodological problems with each of these methods that I can talk about later, which make it difficult for me to use these for that particular context. So instead, I use this new class of methods called stochastic actor-oriented models, called SAOMs. And this is becoming increasingly popular in the network behavior context. And it's essentially a simulation-based model for network growth. And this actually comes from a long tradition of using simulation models in networks. There's work by Kaplan, Carley, Michael Macy, who have a long history of work doing social network simulation models, agent-based models, right? So the advantage that the actor-oriented models, the SAOM model provides you is it's a lot more flexible. So you can design flexible network effects into the model and estimate them. You can test counterfactuals, so you can change those effects and see what happens to the network. You can change certain things, etc. You can do all the things you can do with a regression model, right? Model fit testing, flexible hypothesis testing, interaction effects, everything. Right? So one of the key characteristics of this model is it actually models the network evolution as a Markov chain after conditioning on an initial observed state. All right. So this is actually an improvement on exponential random graph models. So for those of you who might have used ERGM or random graph models, might be familiar with this type of modeling. So okay, just for those who are not familiar with random graph models, this is an illustration of how the model works. So let's assume that you have observed data on the network and behavior in two states, P0 and P1, 2 time periods. So this is a simple network. The nodes are colored based on some behavior. So maybe they're smokers, they're the dark node. If they're non-smokers, it's a white node. So you observe the network in P0 and then in P1. And what you really want to do is you simulate what's called microsteps in the network, till you can go from one observed state to the other. So these microsteps are defined as a simulation step where you can change exactly one thing about the network or the behavior. So you either add or delete exactly one link, or you change the behavior by one unit. You can only make one change in a microstep. So then, of course, the question is, how frequent are these microsteps, right? How many microsteps do I need to simulate? And how do you decide what changes in a microstep? And so for that, there are actually functions, objective functions and rate functions that decide on how many microsteps happen and what changes in any one microstep. Okay, so I'm not going into the details for a lack of time, but what I want to just point out here is this evaluation function here. Okay, so you can ignore the endowment function and disturbance for now, but this is actually the main point of this model. This is your utility or objective function that you have to optimize, which decides what changes in a microstep. And again, if you're familiar with random graph models, this might look familiar to you. Your evaluation function is actually like a weighted sum of many different network effects that you want to model in that study. So imagine if you want to model influence, similar to what I'm interested in. There are some basic effects that exist in every network. So out degree effect basically says that the network grows over time. Every network grows over time. So you include this. There might be transitivity. So human social networks tend to show clustering. So you have this in the model as well. And then you can add in something called the peer influence effect. And again, if you look at the specification, what it's basically doing is it's calculating the similarity, average similarity between you and the behavior of your peers. So this PI over here is your behavior, and PJ is the behavior of some peer J. And it's normalized by the number of friends you have. So A is the adjacency matrix. It's a number of connections that you have. Right? So I mean, the point of showing you this is you can flexibly define these functions to capture certain aspects of the network that you want to estimate in that particular study. And then once you do that, the way to estimate this model is, again, it's the two-state network. You have these microsteps, and every microstep you have a simulated network, and you compute a simulated statistic, say, for example, the out degree for each of these simulated networks. And ideally, if everything goes well, the average of your out degree, so it's like a rolling average, will converge to the observed out degree in T2, in T1, right? So you start with an observed network, keep simulating networks, keep computing a statistic for this simulated network, and keep tracking that statistic till it reaches to a close distance of your observed statistic for the next observed network. And that's where it converges. Go ahead. Sorry, what's that? S, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it's like out degrees, it's like average out degree for the network.
But the parameters are also, but the parameters are on H hub.
Correct. I don't know. Yes. So this is, I mean, so the question was, the tracking statistic is actually at a network level, but the parameters that you back out once the convergence happens is at the individual level. So this actually is more like, you know, you're tracking the model fit, right? So whether there is convergence of the model or not. All right. So once the model converges, you can actually back out the parameter list, which is beta k, which tells you the strength of those effects that you're modeling, right? So we use this to, you know, an actual data set of the online social network from American University over a period of 6 months. And this data includes their social network and some anonymized public data that we have posted on the platform. And so again, this was, again, just to recap, the question was to see if their friends' posting behavior affected their own posting behavior. So the first question here is, do we see evidence of peer influence after accounting for homophily? And second, and this is something I was interested in, is there evidence of heterogeneity? So do some students react to peer influence differently than other students? All right, so this actually just shows that the network grows over time. So this is the average degree of the network's average number of connections. It's a moderately growing network over the 6-month period. This actually shows the Jacquard index over there is a measure of network stability. So it tells you how many networks, it's a ratio of the number of nodes that remain the same across time periods divided by all possible changes that happen in the network. Okay? And it basically tells you that the network is fairly stable, which is important because the model is based on Markovian assumptions. So you wouldn't want some major event affecting your network formation or your behavior, right? So this actually gives you confidence that the network is actually pretty stable. So in terms of the actual findings, we noticed that there's no observable homophily on the basis of any of the covariates, all right? However, interestingly, we actually found that there is something called posting homophily, which means people do make friends based on similarity in posting behavior, right? And we also noticed there is a significant but negative estimate for influence, which means that people respond to their peers' posting behavior, but in the opposite direction. So if your friends start posting more, you reduce your posting behavior, and vice versa, right? And then interestingly, we actually found that there is evidence for some heterogeneity, right? So we found that for high posters, people who are high volume social media posters, they actually do not like making friends with other high volume social media posters. And low volume social media posters, so these are like maybe closer to the lurkers, who just they're mostly reading and not posting too much. They like making friends with other low intensity and low volume social media posters. However, for influence, the relationship is reversed. High volume posters are more susceptible to influence from their peers in the same direction, right? So if the peers start posting more, they start posting more. Low volume posters are also susceptible to their peers, but in the opposite direction. So if their peers start posting more, they start posting less, and vice versa. So there's influence, but in the opposite direction. So there's a very interesting interplay between homophily and influence that you can estimate separately. Okay, so this is one study, and I'll take 2 minutes. 2 minutes. The definition of, okay, so the question is, what's the definition of making friends? In this case, it was a structural network. So think of it as a Twitter follower-followee kind of a network, or Facebook friends.
Defined by I follow you.
Yes, it's based on, correct. So this is based on a mutually agreed friendship network. I send you a friend request, you accept. Measured by, so this is a friendship network. It's not a follower-following network. Yeah. Mutually agreed friendship network. So I mean, think of a Facebook friendship network. So I send you a friend request, you accept it, and then we became friends.
And that not based on a platform that are already
Correct.
based on Facebook platform, so it's all based on ready-made mechanisms in a network. So in the case, making friends here is by what's the word that you use?
Mutually agreed friendship.
Okay, so that's how it's operationalized in terms of making friends. Okay, so oh, sorry, my follow-up. I forgot my follow-up question. My follow-up question is then because you're trying to make some kind of direct contribution to friendships on Facebook, but now because it's measured by this specific way that you conceptualize making friends, how does that limit the theoretical contribution? Maybe I'm getting too far ahead because you're not there yet. Yeah.
So let me answer a slightly different question, but which gets to your original question, which is the way I operationalize or define my network has implications for generalizability, right? So given this a friendship network, I don't differentiate between how many of these friends you actually are close to, right? So even though I might have 100 friends, I might be particularly sensitive to the posting behavior of 10 of them. The others I might not care about. So we don't model that heterogeneity in this particular study. There's another study I just want to quickly talk about, which actually focuses on an interaction network, which I think is a much better operationalization of like how close you are to your peers, because there might be a social network, but you only interact with 5 of them, like 5 people. So there is an interaction network that's embedded within your social network, which might be a better use for some of these kind of studies. All right, so maybe I'll just take 2 more minutes to read through this study. And this is actually based on a large student network in Singapore. All right, it's a university network. And so what we want to study here is, do students make ties based on homophily in academic performance inside an academic course? So do students strategically form, so the tie here is an interaction network, right? So do students prefer to interact with other students who are similarly placed in their academic performance? And if so, is there evidence of peer influence? So once they start interacting more and more, do these interactions then affect their downstream academic performance? And then of course, I mean, there could be other heterogeneities, like do these peer effects then vary for high performing students versus low performing students, right? So these are, again, it's a very policy relevant question, right? And one thing that I'm not be talking about here is this also has implications for other economic outcomes downstream. It's not just about academic performance, but what happens in the job market, what happens to their mental well-being. So there are many other kinds of outcomes that we can potentially study. So this actually, the data for this comes actually from the US. This has a large collection of data on like a sample of students from one particular program over an 8 semester, 8 semesters, right? Yeah, 4-year, 8 semester period course. So we have information on what courses they select, how they interact with each other on the learning management platform, and what happens to their grades. All right, anonymized data, but we have data on these aspects. So what we observe, interestingly, is as the semesters go by, there's increased clustering based on academic performance. So first, I think students improve their academic performance, which is expected. So the more semesters go by, you strategically try to improve on your performance. But also, students tend to interact more with people within their kind of academic performance levels, right? So that's something that we observe, this correlated behavior. Go ahead.
Just clarification, when you say interaction, what do they do to that? How do they utilize the learning platforms, like answering questions, discussing things?
So it could be, so we don't distinguish between the type of interaction, which I think in hindsight we should. But this is, it could be answering questions, it could be discussing about a particular topic, it could be asking questions to one another. So any kind of interaction on the platform is coded as a type.
And there's no structural reason why I would interact with someone. For example, there are randomly assigned or self-selected groups. So we
Yeah.
have to do group interaction online.
That's correct. So these interactions are heavily self-selected, right? Because if you subscribe to a particular module, you're more likely to interact with people who have subscribed to the same module and less likely to interact with others by design. So our model actually takes care of that. So we're talking about that.
This interaction during like class hours, or is it also like social interaction?
Correct. So that's a good question. This is purely interaction on the learning management platform. It could be in class hours, it could be outside class hours.
Okay.
But what's missing here is what they do outside. So they might be roommates. You know, we don't know. Okay, there's a big chunk of high quality interactions which we're missing over here.
So the data came from that learning management
Correct. Yes. And that all of that contributes to latent homophily, right? So we don't capture a lot of latent interactions, which we have to manage somehow in the model. All right, so like some very interesting descriptive summary. So we actually found that high performing students, mid performing students, and low performing students tend to have very distinct network sizes persistently across the semesters. So you start with, say, the red line here is a high cap student. So you start with a high average degree, and then you kind of maintain that over time, even though it dips a little bit, but it kind of catches up. Low performing students have smaller networks in terms of interactions, and they kind of catch up later on. And this actually has been studied in other forms. So there's this whole study on the rich club phenomenon in schools, which shows how high-performing students form these tightly knit groups of other high-performing students fairly early on in the semester, and the weaker students try to catch up. So this kind of is still an association, but it hints that there might be something of this going on.
So, just quickly, it's because your measurement of interaction is basically kind of a proxy for engagement with class, right? So it's not necessarily network size, it's just size more involved in learning.
Correct. Yeah. So this is the size of the interaction network. It is possible. So to your question, it's possible that a high-performing student might just have few curated engagements which are of high quality. In that case, the network size will be small, but it will still be beneficial. What we are capturing here is just like the size of the entire set of network interactions that the person has over the semester period.
That's what makes them more engaged in the class itself. But do you see like differences in terms of diversity? Because it would be interesting to see who they are actually interacting with, like as you grow the sector. How diverse is the? I know like the cluster, but because there are a lot of studies on I mean, I guess GPA is only one to mention, but diversity is helpful because you get different opinions, different ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we haven't tracked, and that's an interesting way because we haven't looked at the content that's not accessible to us in what they're saying, but we only have access to the structure and links. But yeah, it would be good to do some content analysis to understand what they're talking about. Right? Yeah.
Classification question. Can we go back? Clarification. So like, what's the operationalization of their cluster? Like why? It's like why are they getting cluster? It's like, how do you operationalize that?
Okay, so that's actually a very interesting question. And it goes back to something more fundamental, that why do people exhibit homophily, right?
No, it's like operation. How you're measuring the
I mean, how do we generate these clusters?
Yeah.
So this is, but this is based on, so this is based on a particular community detection method that we use. And so, are you talking about how do you measure the quality of the clustering?
No, just
it's like their clustering is based on the group discussion or the final project, or why are they?
Yeah, so I think the clustering is purely based on their structural links, not based on any topics or any other things that they're. So it's purely based on the network structure.
Then their link is based on what? It's based on
The links are based. Yeah.
okay.
It's just that the nodes, I mean, after the clustering, we just color the nodes based on their academic performance. Yeah, but the performance doesn't go into the clustering method. All right, so actually, just to show you the problem, this is the empirical challenge that we face. So within each semester, they first select a course. So students are not randomly assigned to a course, right? So they self-select, which then leads to a change in their interaction network. So you interact more with people in your course. And then that network then in turn changes their academic performance, which then in turn, so this whole thing influences their course selection in the next semester, right? So the one reason for this could be if you've taken a really difficult course in one semester, you want to take an easier course in the next semester, or if you've made really good friends, you might want to take the same courses that your friends have taken. So there's a lot of association across semesters. So this is the empirical challenge that we have to solve. Right, so we use the same coevolution model. So the bit over here in the middle is the same as what you saw in the previous study. So we're trying to model this kind of interplay between homophily and influence. The only additional layer is we have a selection model before that, which generates the course joining probabilities for each student based on a variety of measures. Right, so what's the probability, the predicted score for each student for each course? And we use that as an additional covariate in our coevolution model that you saw in the previous study. And again, I'm just to kind of very interesting, actually, let me just show you the visualization here. All right, so this is actually what we find from the study. We find that on average, for middle achievers, we see significant evidence for both homophily and influence. So they make friends with people who have similar academic performance, and then they get affected by their academic performance. Now, what's interesting is for the top 25 percentile of the class, we see a stronger homophily. So they have a much stronger tendency to interact with people belonging to the top 25 percentile. And they also have stronger influence. So they're also more likely to get affected in their academic performance by the high achieving students. Conversely, for bottom achievers or bottom performers, we find that there's this negative homophily, it's almost heterophily. So they don't like interacting with people, or they're less likely to, I shouldn't say they don't like, they're less likely to interact with people in the same band of academic achievement. And then there's also weaker influence compared to the other two groups. They're less likely to get affected. And again, just to clarify over here, a point about homophily. A homophily just tells you that you see correlated behavior based on some similarity. It actually doesn't tell you that it's strategic. So this, you shouldn't interpret this as, bottom achievers are strategically not trying to do something. Maybe they want to be part of some other group, but maybe they were excluded. So it's kind of homophily by non-reciprocity. They were left behind, so they have to just do with whatever is available, and that creates this homophily. So homophily is not always chosen by you. Sometimes the decision is made for you. All right, so this is actually what we find in our, so we have a preprint on this, I can share that with you as well. But the point of this is to highlight that network interaction within universities can lead to quantifiable gains in academic performance, which in turn have downstream effects on labor market participation, subjective well-being, things like that. High-performing students tend to develop larger interaction networks fairly early on in the program, almost kind of like a rich club phenomenon. But then an interesting insight from that is, educators and policymakers need to think about early stage interventions that can seed interactions for the weaker students. How do you get weaker students to participate more, be more engaged, so that you can kind of seed their network formation with additional help? So that's kind of the policy implication from this. And of course, there's a lot of challenges here. The biggest challenge that we kind of trying to encounter right now is the unobserved interactions, unobserved relationships. What are the students doing outside the platform that we don't know about? And there are some known ways to tackle latent homophily that I can talk about offline with you. So we're trying to use that. Those are some of the methods to control for latent homophily. There's also, I think, a question, brilliant question earlier about how do you control for the quality of interactions. So we don't have any access to content for privacy reasons. So we don't know what they're talking about, right? So this is a major absence of data that we don't really can't do anything about. And then finally, this model, I mean, is a Markovian model. So it is based on the assumption that your network behavior state is entirely explainable by the network behavior state in the previous period, which might or might not be true in different situations. So if there's like a major shock to the network, so the new education policy, or there's new, there's COVID, right? It vastly changes how you interact or how you study. Then this model might not be super useful, or it might end up in biasing some of these estimates. All right. Okay, so final slide. I just want to leave you with this slide on other active areas of interest, and I don't know if some of these might be more interesting to you. So I think with insight come from a social and behavioral influence group. Amy is also a part of over here. So within our group, we actually do a lot of work on things like digital interventions and understanding how some of the interventions can be implemented in a cheap, scalable way, and studying behavior as a result of that. So then this creates a fertile context for studying network effects on many different kinds of behavior, right? So a good example of this is putting people in an online community and trying to see if what they learn can spread through the network to other people, and you get like literacy gains by being members of a particular community. There's a big chunk of work that people are interested in, which I'm kind of peripherally interested in, but this whole idea of how network effects influence the political discourse, and how things like fake news, misinformation, disinformation can spread through a network. Who spreads these information? What are the mechanisms through which they spread? And what are the end results or end outcomes that they impact? And of course, there's a lot of work on how your position in a social network or your engagement or participation can lead to improvements in subjective well-being, mental health, and other kinds of positive outcomes. Maybe not necessarily economic, but more subjective outcomes that you can track. And so these are areas that people have been working on recently. Some of these things we do with our research group, but if you're interested in any of these, we are very happy to chat more. I think I've come to the end of my talk, so if you have any questions, you can talk. I know I'm standing between you and lunch, so if you also want to talk over lunch, that'll be fun. Yeah. Thanks, Shubhan. Thanks, Jack, other organizers, for this wonderful opportunity. Yeah, thank you for being such a patient audience.
Okay, so we are quite flexible on time. So technically lunch starts at 12, but whenever lunch is already served, so we can have a few more questions now, or we can all just head to lunch and talk about lunch. So if there are any pressing questions you want to ask Prasanta now, feel free.
So I've got two. One is about the results and one is more about practical one. Starting with the results, the lower achievers have an weaker interest, but kind of being like to be the central group of the higher achievers. Could that actually be beneficial to the lower achievers in that they're then protected from comparisons and essentially they might make them achieve even worse if they're comparing themselves?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point. It might actually be strategic to pair weaker students with slightly higher achieving students so that they can get some, I don't know, performance gains from the interaction. But I don't know if you've noticed that the same study or the same model actually showed that even though they show weaker homophily for similar students, they also show weaker influence, which means that if they are forming connections with dissimilar others, those others are also not influencing them. So then I think the implication of this is, yes, we need to do that, like better peer support, but then we also need to have better strategies for seeding more productive interactions so that, this transfer of gains can happen better, because our current results show that it's not working out right now.
It's practical in terms of, so the first study, you had like 2,500 participants, things that are those paid, how long do you track the data for, and then practical question, how do you run such a study? Likewise for the one at NUS, obviously over 600 people, tracked over a long time, so I guess manpower or ways of actually collecting this data, storing it, all that I guess if people are interested, like tips on how to conduct such a study, I guess.
Yeah, so I think for the first study, the data actually comes from a social media platform. So that was, the data came as part of an ongoing work that was happening with other people, and so we had got some data from that, all anonymized. For the second study, it's actually, so I should mention the second study, the main researcher on that, this is a person called Ding Dan, who's also the lead author on that paper, and Tuan Fan, both of whom were in NUS and now they moved on to other universities. There's actually a center called ALSET in NUS that gives you access to curated student performance interaction data that you can work with them, and they can do they can take care of the data provenance and other parts of it, so you can focus more on the analysis. But there's a way to interact with them, get access to that data, and work with them on that. In general, for a lot of my other work that I haven't shown here, I do work with, or I've at least worked in the past with a lot of industry partners. And I guess the key challenge of doing CSS kind of work with industry partners is, as researchers, we are interested in like socially meaningful insights. But on the other side, you have to create quantifiable value for the company to continue working with you on that, right? So I think the question is, how do you do the translation where you generate socially meaningful insights, but you can also go from there to really be able to articulate what's the economic value that comes out of it if you're working with an industry partner, or like how does this guide policy making if you're working with a public sector organization? I think that's the challenge we all face right now. But that's a translation that I've been able to successfully do for some of my projects and unsuccessfully for a big majority of others.
Well, I have a question. Is that like concerning the causal effect here? Is like I'm interested in morality stuff, and there are studies concerning that moral homophily will lead to the homogeneity in networks. So, and they did not only correlation like observational data, but they also run experiments to confirm that sort of causality there. But meanwhile, as you suggested, there could also be a peer effect coexisting at pretty much the same time, right? It's like, so it might, so what they say is from X to Y is the causality. And if I'm trying to say that from the network to morality, it's like from Y to X, then it becomes a little bit weird in social sciences. Like it can be both the result and the reason. So I just, and they can happen at the same time, right? It's like we have moral homophily, but we are also like have peer effect at the same time. So I wonder like how you, what's your opinion on that sort of, this simultaneous causal relationship, and how, because it can go weird in traditional social science.
It's a very interesting question. I think I want to point to these 4 strategies, right? There are some stylized designs where you might be able to separate out homophily from influence in that behavior. There's no one short solution to this problem. Depending on the research question, you might be able to design like a mechanism experiment, which is like an indirect way of like exogenizing the network without affecting the behavior. Or you might be able to think of like a natural experiment solution to the problem where maybe there you can give a shock to one side and then study the effect on the other. Right? So a good example would be like COVID, right? So COVID people are not moving around. So it's kind of like an interaction shock. But then your network is exogenously changed and you can see the effect of that change on whatever you're interested in, which might not be affected by COVID. That's like, so my answer to you is, I don't think there's any one answer I can give you, but depending on the context, you might be able to design something clever without doing randomized experiments. Yeah, so I think the 4 or 5 solutions that I mentioned here are all indirect ways of trying to do that when randomization is not an option. But so you have to look at these and see if you can implement any of these in that particular context. Sometimes a bit about chance. You think about something clever and you do it. Yeah.
Right. I think that's that. There are no further questions on Zoom either. So thanks again, Prasanta. Or the way we probably speak in our vernacular, thank you, Prasanta. So this was amazing, and I'm sure this is something very new for many of us here, and I'm sure you all appreciated this session. So without further ado, I think we can all break for lunch, and everyone's looking forward to it. So Prasanta is joining us for lunch, and feel free to chat with him or sit with him and talk about more research or other stuff too. Thank you.
Are we coming at 1 or 1:30?